Hi, Mr. Starkey here for our second lesson of this week, week number 9. And today I'm going to talk about examining exercises of the shoulders. Yesterday we talked about the exercises of the shoulders, the deltoids, and those exercises that help work those muscles. And today I want to go over some specifics that don't only apply to the shoulder exercises, but actually apply to every movement we might do in the weight room. And for some of you that think a lot of this is really complicated and doesn't make any sense, I get that because you may not care tremendously about why we do what we do in the weight room. You may not care tremendously about weightlifting in general. You might just have this class by accident. But ultimately, if I had a job to do, it would be to educate you to be smarter when you do your exercise. So for example, we should know things like what I'm about to cover, because I think it's very important for us to grow and learn these things so that when we're older, or even now if you go to, let's say, the Doyle or something, you don't need to pay someone to teach you how to do these basic things. So as a quick review first, what we'll talk about is these phases of movement. If there's any one thing you need to know by the end of this class, as a guarantee, is know the difference between the concentric and the eccentric phases of a movement. They also call them concentric and eccentric muscle contractions. Okay, so here's a great example of someone curling. It's ironically a shot put. So when they bring the shot put up, the bicep muscle, it actually shortens. Okay, this bicep muscle, oops, go back. The bicep muscle itself actually goes from long to short on the concentric portion. Okay? But concentric is always about gravity. Eccentric is always about gravity. Okay, so when they're lowering the ball, so when they're raising the ball up, that is always concentric. And when the ball's going down, that is always eccentric. Okay, so even with the pulleys inside of a weight room or the rubber bands, the movement still centers around where the gravity is going. Okay, so I just wanted to review that very quickly. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is to review very quickly these synergist muscles. So when you're working out, you have some muscles that are the primary movers, as we said before, and the synergist muscles are kind of the secondary muscles that assist with the movement. Okay, so if we look at something very specific here, here is something we had in this week's lesson called a lateral raise. Okay, so lateral raise is abduction of the shoulder. The deltoid muscle is the primary, okay? That is the primary mover for elevation of the arm in abduction, okay? So we can see this guy, again, I hate to give these things with shirts off, but you can see his shoulder muscles here. His deltoid muscles are the ones being worked. Okay, but this muscle here highlighted in blue is called your trapezius. Now your trapezius is not a primary mover, but it does assist with this action of raising your arm. So if you do that, you put your hand right on the back of your neck, and then you raise your arm, you will feel that muscle move slightly because the trapezius is involved with the shoulder. So anytime you're moving the shoulder, you're elevating the shoulders, you're going to have this muscle, the trapezius, involved. Okay, so even though the trapezius is not what we would list as a primary mover, it is a synergist mover. Okay, synergist, any of us coming from middle school might remember these 7 habits, and the habit number 6 is synergize, and ultimately that is what that means. It means something to work together, to work in comparison with it. Okay, so the next thing we were going to talk about is the opposite. Not the opposite. Next thing we're going to talk about is the primary muscle has another name. The primary muscles that create the most force and cause the most damage to a muscle in working out are called agonist muscles. Okay? So agonist muscles are the primary muscles. Okay? In this case, if we had a weight in our hand and we were moving up against gravity in this exercise here, then the bicep would be the agonist muscle. It creates the most amount of force to move the arm into flexion. Okay, and then if you do curls, like if you do bicep curls with the dumbbell, the bicep is what gets worked the most. There are synergist muscles in this, and we'll talk about that specifically in a later unit. But when we think about muscle movement, this bicep curl is probably one of the easiest things to understand. Okay, another term that you've not heard yet is called an antagonist movement. Okay, so if we have paid attention ever in English class, we should know what the antagonist of a story is. The antagonist is the person that's the villain, or the person that opposes our main character, which is the protagonist. Okay, so the agonist muscles are the muscles that create that movement in the opposite direction in most cases, and that play no role in the movement. Okay, so again, if I start here and I'm curling up against gravity, the concentric and eccentric movements are all in the bicep. Okay, so for this specific example on the screen, the tricep is the actual antagonist. Okay, when I do a curl, okay, and I'm bringing gravity up and I have to flex my arm, my tricep is doing almost nothing. Okay, the only thing it's doing is stabilizing my arm. Okay, so when we would say we're doing curls, we should not have any kind of muscle tension or soreness on our tricep muscle. So again, we have the agonist, which is the primary mover. We have synergists that assist in the movement. And we have our antagonist muscles, which are the ones that are moving in the opposite direction. Okay, so looking at this again, okay, here is a front raise. This is called a barbell front raise. Okay, we have lots of different muscles moving here. The main movement, which is why we talked about flexion and extension earlier on, the main movement here is flexion of the shoulder. Okay, and flexion of the shoulder involves the deltoids, it involves pectoralis major, it involves the coracobrachialis, okay, and it involves, well, let's go back. So anyway, that's flexion of the shoulder. These are the three things involved in flexion of the shoulder. Okay, and then if we're thinking about the antagonist muscles, we're thinking about the thing that's the opposite of this motion. So if front raise is flexion of the shoulder, that means the opposite of that is extension of the shoulder. Okay, and what muscles are involved in the extension of the shoulder? The deltoids, the posterior portion of the deltoid, the latissimus dorsi, which is a lat muscle, we'll talk about that in a later unit, and the teres major. So here is the two things that are involved in the movement of the shoulder. So a front raise, because we're thinking about where's gravity in this weight? When the weight is going upwards, it's moving concentrically against gravity. Which muscles are the agonist, which muscles are the synergists, and which muscles are the antagonists? Okay? Well, I have your answer for you. The triceps brachii is another part of the extension of the shoulder. So ultimately, our agonist, our primary mover and flexion of the shoulder is the deltoids. So if you do this exercise, front raise, your shoulder right here, the deltoid muscle, that's what's going to be the most sore when you're doing this motion. Okay? The pectoralis major and the coracobrachialis, they assist. Okay? The pectoralis major just assists in this motion. It is not a primary mover. It is a secondary muscle. And it may only work, I don't know the percentage, I could probably look it up, but it probably only does 2, 3, 5% of the work. So if you want big pecs, doing front raise is probably not going to be your primary way to do it. As far as the antagonist muscles, everything that's involved in the opposite direction is the antagonist muscles. Okay, so here's our next exercise we want to look at. If this is called 3 answers were on the quiz for you. It was dumbbell post raise, it was called reversed flies, and bent over lateral raise. There's 3 versions of 3 answers, 3 names for this same exercise. Okay? But one of the names I want you to think about right now is called reverse flies. If you think about a regular dumbbell fly, right? Dumbbell flies, work the pec muscles, okay, moving against gravity. So this is the exact opposite of it. And the question I want you to ponder when we think about agonist and antagonist muscles is right here in this motion, is she doing any pectoralis major work? If she did this 100 times, will she have sore pectoralis major muscles? The answer is no, because the concentric motion up against gravity is working primarily the muscles in her rear deltoid, in her teres major, and the muscles in her back. Okay, the synergist muscle here would be her low back to keep her in this correct postural position. Okay, and the antagonist muscles would be her pectoralis major. Okay, so this would never make your pecs bigger. Even though she's making a motion together, that's with gravity. She's eccentrically making the pec motion. So there's no resistance, which means there's no muscle damage, which means she can't get stronger.